Tonight we're going to talk about evolution, or as Dr. Richard Dawkins says, evolution. Make up your own mind, but certainly it's one of the most controversial subjects in the church, actually in the public at large. And the thing that's interesting about it is that most people, whether they say they believe in evolution or they don't believe in evolution, have no idea what it is. They couldn't explain it to you, even in a fundamental, basic way. So that's what I'm going to try to do tonight and next week, is give you at least a conversational understanding of the biology of evolution, what it actually is, because when you find out what it actually is, it may change your opinion about whether or not you believe it could actually happen. And one thing that I want you to remember as we go along is that evolution is a scientific theory, okay? And what that means is people say, well, I believe in it or I don't believe in it. It's really not an issue of believing or not believing. It's a scientific theory, which means that it must stand or fall on the evidence, just like any other scientific theory. It's not like, hey, I think Aerosmith is a better band than Lynyrd Skynyrd. You know, you can't do that with evolution. And so that's why it's important to understand what it's all about. And we're going to get to the molecular level. It's hard to say. And I'm going to make cell biologists out of you tonight, hopefully. Now we're going to break this thing down into some smaller pieces. And tonight we're going to talk about, first of all, the theological implications of evolution. What does the Scriptures actually say about it? You know, when we talked about the Big Bang, we found out the Scriptures were loaded with references to the Big Bang. That a lot of you might not have known actually were in the Scriptures. There's some things in the Scriptures about evolution, or that could lead to a decision about whether or not you believe in evolution, strictly from the Scriptures. The next thing we're going to talk about is the origin of life. There's a saying out in the scientific community, before you can survive, you must arrive, okay? The origin of life, although many evolutionists will complain that it's not part of evolution, understand that life has to exist in some form before evolution can take place. You have to have something to select before natural selection can actually work. So we're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry of the origin of life, and that's having had a lot of chemistry and worked with a lot of chemistry in the years that I worked, had a job. I'm going to give you some opinion about the chemistry because of the conditions of the early earth and what it actually takes to make life from non-life, okay? And then we're going to hope, if we don't finish up the last part tonight, we'll let it carry over to next week, but we're going to talk about the cell, okay? The fundamental unit of life on planet Earth, the cell. And we talked about the first life being single-celled animals we call prokaryotes. A prokaryote is a type of cell that is only single cell. When it reproduces, it just makes another one, and that's it. And then we talk about eukaryotic cells, which are the kind of cells that are in your body. They can be single cells, they can be single-celled animals, or they can be multicelled animals like us, or mammals and plants and everything else. But we're going to talk about the cell. That, as Darwin thought, was that little simple blob of protoplasm, you know. We're going to see how accurate he was on that. Of course, you know, in 1859, he didn't know a lot about the cell. Nobody had ever looked at a cell. And then next week, we're going to focus on the process of evolution. How does that single cell, through eons of time and what's called natural selection, which you'll be an expert on by the time you get out of here, how does it end up in a guy in a suit? How does that actually work? So we'll spend next week talking about that. And I think that's going to be very interesting because it's going to throw up a lot of questions that evolutionists have a very difficult time answering. And we'll point each one of those out as we go. Now, before we get too far, let's define evolution. It's often called, let me back up one more step here. Evolution is a very general, in biology anyway, I mean evolution, you could say, the evolution of the F-150 Ford pickup truck. I mean, it's a valid word in our language, but when applied to biology, it means a step-by-step change in a particular animal. And it's often called Darwin's theory of evolution. Charles Darwin came up with it, wrote a book called On the Origin of Species. I was going to bring it tonight, but I forgot it. And he goes through his hypothesis about how this happened. Now, there are other theories of evolution. Most of you don't know that. There are theories that have been around for a long time that aren't widely accepted. Stephen Jay Gould, he was G-O-U-L-D. Stephen Jay Gould was a world-known, world-renowned evolutionist back, well, he died in 2004, but he tried to fit the fossil record to the theory of evolution and came up with something called punctuated equilibrium. Punctuated equilibrium. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then there's guys like Fred Hoyle and other people who think the only way evolution could, the only way a cell could have reached the Earth was come from some alien destination. The Earth was seeded with these evolving animals. That's how desperate some of this stuff is getting. And now the latest research talks about a subject called epigenetics. Anybody ever heard of epigenetics? Epigenetics is a very, very interesting concept. It's not a concept, it's very well proven, and it pretty much bumps hard against Darwinian evolution. So we may see a little battle among the evolutionists over the next decade about is the Darwinian model correct, or is the epigenetic model correct, or is it some combination of the two? But it's almost certain that the whole idea of evolution is going to change. Now, so here's the definition. It's a theory stating that all species of organisms arise and develop through the natural selection of small inherited genetic mutations that increase the individual's ability to compete, survive, and reproduce, or as Darwin preferred, the survival of the fittest. So there's two aspects of evolution, and they're kind of backwards in my definition, but genetic mutation has to occur first. We're going to talk about that tonight. Somewhere a gene or a base pair has to mutate. Something has to change to cause evolution to work. Then there's natural selection. And I'm not going to argue much against natural selection. It's pretty much a proven concept. If you take an animal that doesn't have any hair and put him in Antarctica, he's going to freeze to death. That's natural selection. If you take an animal like what are those musk ox? You take a musk ox and put him in Antarctica, and he's going to do just fine. So, natural selection will select the musk ox over the hairless chihuahua or whatever you put out there. So anyway, now, There's something that's very important to keep in mind, because evolutionists generally don't talk about this a lot because it helps their cause when they start giving you examples of evolution. We have two kinds of evolution. Anybody know what they are? Microevolution. Now that's evolution within a species, okay? And I've got an example up here, but I'm going to show you. That's microevolution right there. All of those animals on that slide are all what? They're all dogs. They're of the species, and I don't know the Latin name for it, but they're dogs. But they're all different, right? Now they could have possibly evolved to look like that. Those animals were all bred, and you might call that artificial evolution. But you have for instance, you have tall humans and short humans. You know, there's some genetic differences that create a tall human over, and you could even, if tall people begin to marry one another, you'll have eventually a whole city full of tall people. There are tribes in Africa that are tall, 7 feet tall. So that's microevolution. That's very well documented. Not many people even argue with that. I certainly don't. Then we have another type of evolution called macroevolution. Now this is the one where the controversy comes in. Darwin's little book on the origin of species started out talking about microevolution. But then early on, he decided he would extrapolate his observations about microevolution and propose that new species could come from that very same mechanism. Well, he didn't know it was genetic mutation. He just called it change, inherited change, and natural selection. So in his book, he proposed this theory that we call macroevolution. And what it says is that, every animal on the planet Earth came from one living cell. They called it LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. And that's where we get this, coming from apes to humans thing. That's crossing the line of species. The fish is a coelacanth, but it's been around for hundreds of millions of years. They thought they were extinct. Okay, now, some scientists want the theory of evolution, this macroevolution. Just keep that distinction. Microevolution, see it every day. Macroevolution, that's what we're going to talk about. They want it to be declared a scientific fact. And they ignore some very obvious problems, which we're going to talk about. Generally, people who are agnostic or atheist will accept it because it's the best natural explanation going. Without any supernatural intervention in all of this, biological evolution makes some sense. It does. I believed in it for years till I actually started looking at, what it was. Of course, I worked every day around a bunch of scientists, and they were all kind of in the same boat with me. So what? Yeah, what's the big deal? Okay. The problem is it's taught in public schools across this globe as scientific fact. But is it really scientific fact, or is it a failed scientific theory? That's what we're going to get after tonight. Now, what does Scripture say about evolution? Anything? Yeah, actually quite a bit. Many people around this country are falling away from traditional religious beliefs. And this is really one of the reasons. As the belief in evolution increases, and by the way, the general population has really not bought into the idea of evolution. Probably 60 or 70% of the people in the country at large do not believe in it, or they at least believe that there was some supernatural component to it. So evolution is not taking the general public by storm by any means, but as Christians, we need to be able to defend the Scriptures. Now, and we hadn't decided yet in this thing if the Scriptures support or reject the idea of evolution. We're going to get into that here in a minute, and we're going to try to make that determination, and then we will understand, what we need to do what we need to say as Christians about evolution. Christians get tagged as being anti-science when they say evolution is not a proven theory. I just want you guys to be able to, when you say, if you say, I mean, some of you may believe in evolution, and that's fine. A lot of Christians do. I just want you to be able to defend your position one way or another. This is what I know about it. This is how it works. So, that's what I'm here for. The religious community generally, as I said before, prefers the idea of special creation, which is divine intervention of some kind, or they believe that God is behind every bit of evolution, that the physical laws are so finely tuned that evolution is a natural outcome. And a lot of very influential people in the scientific community believe that. Francis Collins, for instance, who is the head of the National Science Foundation, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think he is. He headed up the Human Genome Project a few years ago. One of the best scientists in the nation, a Christian, a Catholic, but he believes that in what's called theistic evolution. The Scriptures describe 4 ways plant and animal life came about, including mankind. Sometimes we think, well, God just created everything. Hebrew word bara. But he didn't. The Scriptures doesn't say he did, for sure. Let's look at a few of those. In Genesis 1:11, Moses writes, and God said, let the earth bring forth, Hebrew word dasha, grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind. And we're going to get familiar with the little Hebrew word min, M-I-Y-N, that means from one came another of the same kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and so it was. The ancient Hebrew word dasha, which is translated bring forth, that's a correct translation, means to sprout forth or to bring forth in abundance. Okay. So the first time we hear about plants, it didn't say God created plants. It said he brought them forth. Okay, so that's way number one. God talks about bringing forth stuff. Let's look at another thing. Genesis 1:21. The Scriptures say, and God created bara. That means from nothing came something. Bara. In the beginning, God bara the heavens and the earth. That's the word used in the first verse in the Bible. In the beginning, God created. That means something from nothing. Only God can do that. And God created the great whales, or the great sea creatures, and every living creature that moveth, which the waters, here's that little word again, brought forth abundantly after its kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Now, the Hebrew word bara, and again the Hebrew word dasha described this creation event. He created them and then he brought them forth. Remember that. Now that's important. Creation came before bringing forth, all right? Genesis 1:25. Another word is used to describe the production of animal species. And God made asa. You remember we talked about this back in the astrophysical creation part, where God made the sun and He made the moon and He made the star and He made the earth. No something coming from nothing, no bara, it was asa. He made, he took things that already existed and He formed them into something of a different shape or a different kind. And that's how, actually, when you read the scriptures, that's how God made most everything. And God made the beast of the earth after his kind, and the cattle after their kind, and everything creepeth on the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. The word asa has many meanings, but all point to making or producing or molding from existing raw materials. You know, I think most people in the church find that a little bit surprising, that God is not in the snapping His fingers business as much as we all used to think. That He's into the preparing and making business. And when He made it, He made it through the physical laws. Remember the physical laws a couple of weeks ago? That was His way of making it. God's a spirit. He doesn't have hands. He can't go grab a bunch of rocks and stick them together. He let the physical laws, the laws of gravity, those things knitted together the earth and the universe and prepared it for what was to come. All right, so how many is that? We've got dasha, bring forth, bara, create, and asa, made. So we've got 3 so far. Now we're all down to verse 25. Now let's go to Genesis 2, 7, and 8. The scriptures say, and the Lord formed man of the dust of the earth. Yatsar, formed. And breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The Lord God planted a garden east in Eden, and there He put the man whom He had formed. And then later in Genesis 2 and verse 19 it says, out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and brought them to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever name Adam called each living creature, that was its name. Now, yatsar means to press into shape, formed. Okay, that's, you form a pot or something, form something that is again similar to making, but it's more of forming something specifically and maybe even unique or detailed. Okay, more like a sculptor than a construction job. Okay, y'all still with me on this now? That's number 4, yatsar. So we got create, bring forth, make, form. So where does this leave us? All we know so far is God didn't go around snapping His fingers and all these things occurred. They occurred through a different mechanism. It presents the notion that God formed man and all the plants and animals as a potter might form a piece of clay into a pot, carefully molding it from existing raw materials. Remember when we talked about how the earth formed? Remember that? From rocks sticking together, and as it got bigger, it started exerting gravity, and then it got even bigger, and then it started exerting even more gravity, and it got bigger until it vacuumed up all of the debris around it. That's making. That's God making the earth using the universal law of gravitation, one and many other physical laws. Y'all with me on that now? Is that making sense? Okay. If God wanted us to believe everything He created was just like the universe, in other words, from nothing came something. He could have easily communicated that. He had the language would have worked and everything, but he went through the trouble of telling us a different story. Don't get too concerned. Don't look on your face. We're going somewhere with this, okay? He did not create everything from nothing, as a lot of people believe. A lot of people believe Adam was created from nothing. What does it say about Adam? He was formed. Actually, there's 3 words used about the creation of Adam. He was formed, he was created, he was made. So he's special. He got 3 different ways he was put together. And I think we talked about that during the creation story, where the created part of Adam was his soul, something that no other animal in the universe had. They all had arms and legs and bodies and stuff like that, so he wasn't unique from that standpoint. But the soul, the conscience, all of the things that represent the image of God are the created things in Adam. Okay, now, theistic evolution would argue that this describes natural processes. Make, form, bring forth, right? And they have a legitimate argument. But this little word mean that we keep talking about, what does it mean? Kind. In that creation story, it's in there 11 times. Now in 36 verses, something mentioned 11 times. And by the way, 18 times later as Moses refers back to the creation, he uses it again, 18 times in Genesis. Mean, kind. From one kind came another of the same kind. I think God might be telling, can you think of anywhere in the Bible where he repeats himself that many times in that short a period of time? I can't. He's telling us something. What he's telling us is that these things came from the same kind. A cow didn't, or a daffodil didn't give birth to a cow. A chrysanthemum didn't give birth to a cat. A bear didn't give birth to an elephant. A fish didn't give birth to a squirrel. Okay, you got that? Check it out. 11 times in the creation story, 7 more times in the early Genesis chapters, and all referring back to the repeats almost of the creation story. Now let's look at this real quick. Biological classification. Now remember, these are all man-made, okay? From Luca, you go to domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and finally species. Now, this is called top down. I mean, the most broad category coming down to the most specific category. Species is a root word for specific. So the most specific thing in those classifications is species, humans, Homo sapiens sapiens. So, now keep this in mind. Moses didn't know about these classifications, so we don't know what he was talking about when he said one kind comes from its own kind. Was it species? Was it genera? Was it family? You see what I'm getting at? He didn't have the benefit of being able to describe what the Hebrew word mean means in today's biological classification. So we really kind of have to figure that out a little bit. And of course, there's a lot of opinion about it, and I have mine. Now, when you look at how God described animal classifications, you see something clearly different. Remember, we talked about he describes them completely different, whereas the biological classifications are built around morphological characteristics, what the bodies look like. We wouldn't be in the same species as a fish, for instance, because we don't look like a fish. So, in the creation story, we have words like shiretz, which means the moving creature that has life, teeming, swarming, schooling life. Man, that could cover insects, it could cover fish, it could cover lots of things, right? And it's a way to classify animals, agreed? It's just different than the way the biologists do today. Oaf, things that fly, winged insects, birds, etc., things that fly around. That would be pterodactyls and birds and mosquitoes. I mean, it's a wide range of animals, but it's not in the same classification as the biological classifications. Tanine, large unknown sea animals. That could be sharks, whales. It could even be plesiosaurs. I mean, it's just big sea animals, and there are a lot. It can be a blue whale. I mean, there's a lot of them out there. Might be a seal or a walrus or something like that. So it could cover the entire spectrum of sea life if it was large. I mean, it's specifically large animals. Then you have Che, Nepesh, Ramas, living creatures that move about on legs. Kangaroos, rats. I mean, there's deer. I mean, just all kinds of things that could be in there. So are you getting a picture of how the Bible describes them as opposed to modern biology? Nephesh is soulish animals, cats, dogs, things that we make pets out of. Behemoth, large animals. Behemoth, it's the root word. Remes means creeping things. That could be squirrels, rats, hares, things like that. Okay, you got that? So what I'm telling you is that God's biological classifications are completely different from man's biological classifications. Now here's what I've kind of concluded. At best, the scriptures, in my opinion, do not preclude the position of theistic evolutionists, what all this made, formed, brought forth, but it heavily favors the idea of special creation. And the reason I draw that conclusion is because of all the times it uses the word mean, okay? And we know some evolution occurs, microevolution. And if you take today's biological classifications, then you'd have to try to figure out how much space it covers. Is it a family? For instance, if it were a family, instead of a species, most people assume it's just a species, but if it were family, then that would mean we would be relatives of the great apes. I don't think we are. DNA and all kinds of other things say we're not. So it doesn't go back, it's not as general as a family. Genera. Now all of the Homo fossils that we've found that weren't human fit into that genera. Wolves, foxes fit into a genera for humans, but wolves, foxes, coyotes, and dogs are in a genera. So see, that makes a little more sense, don't you think? lions, tigers, leopards, house cats. They're all in the same genera. So, you know, it could be then you have to get real specific and look at the first slide and say, well, if it's species, then it's just dogs. They're very tight. So it could possibly be expanded out to genera. I personally think it is. I think that dogs came from wolves and stuff by breeding practices. So, but I'll leave that up to you. It could be a very specific, just species, or it could be a little wider, but not out to a family where then you would be saying that a human could have evolved from one of the great apes. Y'all got it? Now, the biblical argument against evolution is the fact that from one kind came another of the same kind. The little word M-I-Y-N, mean. But there's even a better argument, I think. Much more compelling argument against Darwinian evolution than any biblical argument. And that's the arguments that the scientific facts simply do not support it. And you're going to see more about that as time goes on. All right, we're going to talk about the origin of life now. Everybody follow me on the theological part of this. Lots said about it. You can start to draw some conclusions, but maybe not narrow in on it as tightly as you'd like to. Certainly, in my way, you couldn't use the scriptures to completely X out the possibility of macroevolution, but it's close. Okay, so let's look at the scientific evidence. Now, origin of life. As I said before, you must arrive before you can survive. So there had to be life for evolution to work on. So where did that life come from? You remember when the first life on Earth started? How long ago, according to the scientists? Almost 4 billion years ago, 3.8 to 3.85 billion years ago. Now let me describe what it looked like on Earth back in those days. There was a period in the formation of the Earth called the Late Heavy Bombardment. And after things had started settling down, apparently a debris field or something came near the Earth, and all of a sudden this huge meteorite started bombarding the Earth about 3.9 billion years ago. And it did so much damage to the Earth that large parts of the Earth were just molten. I mean, they were 1,000 degrees. So no life at all of any kind could have existed on the Earth during the late heavy bombardment. It was a short period of time. It only lasted a few million years. It doesn't sound very short, does it? But it basically left the Earth uninhabitable, okay? 3.9 billion years ago. 3.85 billion years ago, which is the latest information that they have, and it might even go back a little further than that, life appeared on Earth. All right, you say, well, it's 50 million years. It's a long time. Actually, that's an extremely short period of time, considering what has to be done in that period of time. Now, the Earth was still a very harsh place to live. Its atmosphere is full of carbon dioxide, water vapor, and nitrogen. No oxygen, very little. There was some oxygen, but you know, maybe a couple of percent, but not the 21% that we enjoy. So, science has no explanation for how life appeared on Earth so quickly. Their models would predict billions of years of developing these chemicals. We're going to talk about them in a minute. These fragile organic chemicals self-creating and then finding other chemicals that have self-created and starting putting together the first cell. What is life anyway? There's basically three fundamental conditions for life. Some people add another one or two, but must be able to reproduce. A lot of chemistry allows the reproduction of chemical compounds. It has to be able to metabolize or chemically convert available nutrients in the environment into food and energy, okay? If you're going to be alive, you got to have some tacos, right? I mean, you got to have something to eat. And it's got to create energy so you can move around a little bit. Right, Grady? So that's and it has to be able to do that with the nutrients that are around it. Because the early cells were bound by their location. I mean, they couldn't go to McDonald's, you know. I mean, they had to metabolize what they were sitting in, basically, which wasn't very good. And then the third and most complicated part of life, actually, is that it must contain information necessary to build a new organism, and even more than that, the ability to use that information to build this new organism. Okay, you can have a playbook, but you don't play football until you get some football players. So you have to have something in that cell that will cause it to build another animal just like it is. You got that? Pretty simple, but very hard to do. Okay, let me show you what the simplest cell looks like. Now Darwin, he thought that a cell was a little blob of protoplasm, he called it, little organic jelly, basically. But when man first started seeing what cells were made of, I mean, they were just blown away, because there's chemical factories, power plants, computers, machine shops, electric motors, electrical wiring, all of that in this little tiny cell, of which you have 50 to 70 trillion or 100 trillion of them in your body. These little machines are called organelles, and we're not going to get into them tonight because it's seriously complicated, but it's incredibly amazing, the cell. Now, whether that's in a human or a gardenia, doesn't matter. That's kind of what they look like. Okay. And you can see down at the bottom, they can be muscle cells, nerve cells. You know, they can end up in different forms, because we got lots of, we got hair, we got teeth, we got eyes, we got hearts, we got feet. So all those different kinds of cells. Okay, here's the question from science. How did all this first living life come about? And science basically says, we don't know. Now that's something. Even Richard Dawkins says, well, we just don't know. But it wasn't God, we know that. We just don't know how it works. So what did Darwin say about it? Well, he proposed that life first happened in what he called a warm little pond. Now, I don't know if he was talking about an ocean or something the size of the Gulf of Mexico or the Mobile Bay or a mud hole in your backyard. I mean, I'm not sure. And he postulated that this warm little pond was full of dissolved chemicals, which it likely was. At that point, at 3.85 billion years ago, any pond you would pick, if you were to take a drink out of any body of water on this earth, it would kill you. It's full of poisons, full of bad stuff. But he believed that these chemicals bumping around on each other would start reacting, which some of them will, and they would start making these little precursor molecules they call prebiotic molecules, amino acids, things like that, sugar molecules, phosphate molecules, which are very simple. I'm going to show you a couple of them in a second. And that sooner or later, just from chance, okay, they would start knitting together a few compounds that would ultimately yield a protein molecule, which would ultimately yield some living entity. What is a protein molecule? Protein molecules we're made out of protein. We are protein, basically. We've got a few other things, but that's what we are. We're protein. And amino acids are the building blocks that make proteins. Think of protein as long pop bead, chains of pop beads. Y'all know what pop beads are? Have you ever seen them? Stick them together. That's what proteins look like. They're called polymers. At least that's what I call them. They call them something else in biology. And each one of those beads in a pop bead chain is an amino acid, which is a very simple chemical compound found frequently in nature. So they had to somehow stick themselves together to make a protein, which was even worse than that. It had to be a functioning protein. It had to do something, okay? So let's look at an amino acid. See if anybody's ever had a chemistry course. Doesn't take long to see that's pretty simple chemistry right there. Adenine and cytosine, that's two out of four amino acid molecules that are found in DNA, in every cell in your body. So how easy are these guys to manufacture? Well, let me tell you, hard. You go to a chemistry lab. Sam and Alan and me and Grady and a lot of guys in here understand. You put up all this fancy apparatus, you clean it immaculately clean. You put pure, we call them reagents, reactants in there. You run them at excruciatingly close operating conditions, temperatures, pressures, pH. Concentrations have to be just right. And if you do all that just right, you might make an adenine, or you might make a cytosine. It can be done under those kinds of conditions. Now you take the reactants and dump them in a mud hole, okay? You just trickle a little HCN, hydrogen cyanide. You don't want to be around that, do you, Sam? You just dump a little of that in the mud hole, let it stir up, and you're going to make adenine? Now, worse than that, if you even could make these things, how do you get them to polymerize? I made my living polymerizing compounds, and I tell you, it would take a chemical plant bigger than this church campus to do it. And we'd make a ton of byproducts that we had to figure out what to do with and use an enormous amount of energy, and it's just not easy. Cytosine, the same way. So here's what I'm telling you, as a guy who's practiced chemistry all my life. Life is not going to self-create. The chemistry is far, far, far too complicated. The pH, the concentrations, the operating conditions. One of these chemicals that I'm talking about of the four is synthesized at 100 degrees centigrade, boiling water. One of the other ones is synthesized at minus 20 degrees C. Okay, how do you find a warm little pond somewhere, then in one end of it is boiling and the other end of it it's frozen? So this is the challenge that the origin of life idea had. All right, now here's another little thing. That's a protein. That's one of those pop bead chains I've told you about. Well, the interesting thing about proteins is they don't work in a chain. They have to be balled up and knotted up just right and make this blob that you see. And if one protein, there may be 25,000 amino acids in that chain, okay? If one of those amino acids is wrong, 21 different types of amino acids in there. If one of them is wrong, that thing don't work. Where it's supposed to bend and fold and crease, it doesn't, somewhere it doesn't crease, okay? So you get something that looks different. Instead of getting a heart muscle, you get cancer. Now, does that blow your mind or what? Just one of those little amino acids up there, wrong. And that cell, that protein will create a cancer cell as opposed to a heart cell, heart muscle cell. This is how fragile all of this is. Now, the world record for laboratory synthesized protein is 242 amino acids long. It was done in Vanderbilt's chemistry department in 2011. The longest protein synthesized in one of your cells every day, right now while you're sitting here. What did I say? 30,000. Actually, the number's between 27 and 33,000 average. 30,000 of these little amino acid chains that bend and fold and crease and mesh together into this three-dimensional shape that I showed you. No problem. That's what's going on in your cells right now. So the best laboratory in the United States, the world record, 242 amino acids. Your cell would build one that wrap around this building 2 or 3 times on that scale. Are y'all impressed? You know, as a chemist, chemical engineer, I'm extremely. So, you know, just saying, the idea of this happening, this 30,000 chain happening by itself in a muddy hole, in a muddy mud hole, 3.85 billion years ago, when Vanderbilt can only put 242 of them together. I think Dr. Phil says it all. You know? Hey, I wouldn't hang my hat on it. The odds of a functioning protein happening by chance, even once, are so impossible as to never be possible in a trillion universe lives. Okay, that's a kind of a number guys have cooked up. In other words, it would take a trillion universes trying it before, and even then, I mean, the number's absurd. It's far more difficult than that. Because I don't know what comes after a trillion. What, quadrillion? What comes after quadrillion, Alan? Tetrillion? Or quintillion? I don't know. I just said trillion, but it's far out there. A trillion's a big number. So it'd take a trillion universes to self-create one of these things. Like Dr. Phil says, you know, go figure. Just now, that's not even the beginning of the problem. That is not even the beginning. Because inside this little cell I showed you is a compound called DNA, which we've talked about before, deoxyribonucleic acid. It is a computer software with 3.2 billion lines of code. Never been one. Bill Gates said, hey, we've never built one that big, but that's what DNA is. In every cell, in every animal on this earth. Now, not 3.2 billion, that's in the humans. Gladiolas have got a different number, but it's not a lot smaller. Exactly built the same way, exactly doing the same job. Information. Where did that come from? I mean, it's difficult enough to even grasp the possibility that the chemistry might have worked, but where did the information come from? Where did the information to build a human being from conception to death and operated through that period of time come from? Alan and I and Sam used to run chemical plants, and we had to operate, not to mention the blueprints and the stuff it took to build the thing. Then we had to operate it, right, Sam? Manual after manual after manual, under constant review. I mean, we could have libraries full of these things to operate a very simple little process compared to a cell. And all of that about how operating a human being is all in that DNA. Now, to make matters worse, if it wasn't hard enough, here's something that causes chemists for sure to scratch their head. Anybody ever heard of chirality or chiral? All right, look at my hands. They're the same, right? Everybody says they're the same? I see. You think they're the same? Huh? Oh, look! Oh, wait a minute. They don't look the same anymore. That's called chirality. C-H-I-R-A-L-I-T-Y. They're mirror images, non-superposable. You remember those amino acids I showed you up there a minute ago? They come in right-handed and left-handed versions. You know, they're called stereoisomers. Okay, nature, when they put these chemicals, or not even nature, but in a chemical lab, if you have a yield to an amino acid, half of them are going to be left-handed and half of them are going to be right-handed. They're going to be mirror images of one another. And most of the time it doesn't matter, but sometimes it matters vastly. I mean, it won't work, okay, in what you're trying to make. So in nature, you would expect to find 50% left-handed, 50% right-handed, right? Well, guess what? All of the amino acids in DNA are left-handed, every single one of them. I wonder how self-assembly figured out how to do that. Well, we'd have to isolate all of the little left-handed guys, which you can do. It takes a lot of elaborate apparatus to do it, and we'd have to use them in our synthesis. That's not what, but you know, the first cell, according to naturalists, wasn't built in a lab. It was built in a mud hole. I'm sorry, a warm little pond. It was raining all the time during that period of time, and I imagine it was a mud hole. I mean, you know, it just had to be. Okay, so that's kind of like adding insult to injury. Well, let me give you another insult. All of the sugars in DNA are right-handed, and they're also stereoisomers. I mean, after a while, this gets absurd. There's, you know, as a chemist and a chemical engineer, it is not even conceivable. In fact, it's laughable to think that these compounds could have put themselves together in a warm little pond. We can't do it in the best laboratories in the world. Are y'all with me on that now? Anybody disagree with that and want to win a Nobel Prize here tonight? I mean, here's your chance. And also, let's not forget the impossibly short amount of time it had, you know, only a few million years, geologically speaking. So it had short time, impossible chemistry, all left-handed and right-handed amino acids, a warehouse full of information that nobody knows where it comes from. Now, they've got little theories going, but so far, none of them have even come close to working. They've even done computer simulations on this, and you know, claim some success, but when you look at it, they're not evolving anything. They're putting results and writing a computer program to get that result. That's not fair. That's not what nature would do. Very difficult job, but is there any kind of a reasonable solution to this? Suppose that some intelligence that created the physical laws that created the universe as we know it assembled the first reproducing life forms the very instant the Earth's environment would sustain it, which it was. Life showed up at the earliest possible time. Suppose the first life form was designed to metabolize the poisons that it was floating around in, left over from its formative years, and given the task of cleaning those things up, which it did a masterful job of doing. And suppose those first life forms were able to thrive, not just survive, but thrive in that environment. Now you would say, yeah, but that would take something like God, huh? I'll leave you to decide the answer to that. Now here's what you're faced with. You can believe the impossible. A lot of people do. Dr. George Wall, who won a Nobel Prize, said, hey, if you're going to be a naturalist like me, he was, you got to believe the impossible. A guy knew enough chemistry to know that this couldn't happen. He said, you just have to believe the impossible. So, I mean, if you're comfortable with believing the impossible, then this is what you should believe, that life self-assembled itself in some warm little pond. Or you can believe that an intelligent agent was at work somehow and designed this life form just perfectly suited for this harsh environment and gave it a job to do, which it's still doing, by the way. There's still a lot of those prokaryotes around you. Staph infection, prokaryote, strep. Most of the time they're bad, but there's a lot of good ones out there. So I'm just going to leave it to you. You can believe the impossible, believing that there's some intelligent cause out there. DNA. For anybody who's ever watched CSI, they know what DNA is. Or at least they've heard the term. Locked inside every DNA molecule is all the information it takes to build and operate an organism, whether it's a gladiola, a blue whale, a Jack Russell Terrier, whatever. All of that is locked in to that DNA molecule. Deoxyribonucleic acid. Actually, it's a fairly simple molecule, but it's just a huge, long polymer. It replicates itself, and it's difficult to synthesize because of its length mainly. But it's just made up of a phosphate molecule connected to a sugar molecule connected to another phosphate. It's called the backbone. If you remember, it looks like a twisted ladder, right? So keep that in your mind, that the rails of that ladder are made up of this repeating sequence of simple phosphate, simple sugar, right-handed sugar, right? Phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, phosphate, sugar, forever. And the ladder rungs are made up of 2 amino acids. And there's only 4 possible choices. Adenine, guanine, thymine, cytosine. Okay, and they can only be in 2 different combinations because chemically they can't connect cytosine and guanine and adenine and what was the other one? Okay, guanine. Spoke to him here. But the order can be reversed. So you got the phosphate, sugar, backbone, and the amino acid ladder rungs. And you say, so what? I mean, hey, that's cute. A molecule that looks like a ladder. what's important is that those ladder rungs are information. They're like digital instructions in a computer. And the arrangement of those things determines what proteins are made in your cell, how your cell is regulated. All of the things that operate your cell is buried in the sequencing of those rungs. The ladder rungs are called nucleotide pairs or base pairs. And as I said before, in a human, there are 3.2 billion of them. It's a lot of them. A piece of DNA, if it was somehow pulled out of a cell, a human cell, and connected together, would be 6 feet long. And you add up all the pieces in your body, 50, 60, 70 trillion cells, wrap the equator 2 million times. Long, a lot of DNA in you. Of course, you can't see it. Check out my math. Nucleotide, the base pairs, okay? We're going to talk about codons and triplets. Now, imagine that ladder, and you got 3 of those ladder rungs, 3 ladder rungs. That's called a codon or triplet. And those 3 ladder rungs code for 1 amino acid in that long chain. Remember the long chain, that big ball of amino acids? 3 of those ladder rungs code for 1 amino acid. So if you had 10,000 amino acids in a polymer chain, you'd have to have it'd take up 30,000 nucleotide pairs. You with me on that? It's called a codon. It's very, very similar to the first computers I ever operated, which it took 3 digits to make a number, okay? I mean, it's scary how close this DNA comes to a functioning computer code. Actually, that's what it is. So these three little base pairs, nucleotide pairs, code for a single amino acid in a protein chain. Now, if you take, like I said, if you got 10,000 amino acids in your protein that you're building or that your cell's building, you'll need 30,000 of those nucleotide pairs, right? All right, that 30,000 is called a gene. Now, I know you've heard of that. So you need 3, in the case of this particular protein, you need 3 nucleotide pairs to code for a single amino acid, and then 30,000 of them will be put together into a single protein molecule that bends and folds and turns into this 3-dimensional figure. That's called a gene. And those proteins are what determine how you look, how you're built, the size of your heart, a lot of things, everything about you. Now, remember what I said earlier? One mistake. Let's say when this DNA molecule is being assembled in the cell, one of those base pairs gets flip-flopped, gets substituted, gets changed. And it produces in that string of 10,000 amino acids, one different one. Because if you got your triplet, and you change this one, well, then you code for another amino acid, right? Right, Don? 1 out of 10,000. Hey, what's the big deal? Well, you just made cancer instead of heart muscle. So that's the big deal, all right? You made colon cancer or prostate cancer or breast cancer. I mean, that's what happens, okay? So it's going on all the time. Shows you how fragile and how sophisticated and how detailed. Gosh, I mean, it's mind-boggling to know that one mistake out of 10,000, out of 30,000 nucleotide base pairs, and you could have cancer in one cell out of 50 trillion. Okay? It is, it becomes so mind-boggling that, what is that called when that cell changes? What's the general term for that? Genetic mutation. Remember my definition of evolution? Genetic mutation makes a change that is judged by natural selection. And we're going to talk about that next week.